We're now going to dive deeper into what vicarious trauma is and its impact on the professional and personal lives of attorneys. So joining Michael and me for this discussion is Ellie Feldmann. She's a licensed clinical professional counselor with extensive experience working with professionals in high-pressure environments, providing support for vicarious trauma for those repeatedly exposed to stressful conditions. We'll be taking questions, so please share them in the Q&A tab as you did in the prior session. So Ellie, I'm going to start with you and give you the first question. So what Michael just described is often referred to as vicarious trauma or secondary trauma. And so from a clinical perspective, how would you define vicarious trauma?
Okay, yeah, so starting with, the terms are oftentimes interchanged, vicarious trauma and secondary trauma, and they actually are quite different from each other. Vicarious trauma is more the repeated exposure to traumatic events that actually change your worldview. So, like for cases of sexual assault or, a perpetrator of sexual abuse against a child, over time, hearing that and seeing that, you start to view innocent interactions between an adult and a child differently because you have that lens that you're looking through. Versus secondary trauma, which is more a direct exposure or indirect exposure to a specific event that causes trauma symptoms. So, like a paramedic that comes upon a car accident and might have flashbacks to the scene of the car accident. So much more immediate response, where vicarious trauma is much more built up over time.
Thank you for that distinction. I really appreciate it. Michael, I was a legal aid attorney for 15 years, so I can definitely relate to a lot of what you shared. So that said, though, I know vicarious trauma goes beyond legal aid and the prosecutor's office, as you described. Can you talk a little bit about how vicarious trauma shows up in the careers of other lawyers?
Oh, sure, and I'll speak as a career prosecutor. That's the reason that I did the talk aimed at the criminal justice side of things, because that's what I'm most familiar with. But I have to imagine that the same experiences that I had, the same evidence that I'm viewing, the same photographs, the same stories, equally apply across the board, whether it's a probate attorney learning about the death of a client, or a civil attorney dealing with a wrongful death claim, or a horrific traffic accident on one of our highways. At some point, that attorney or the legal professionals assisting that attorney is going to have to look at and consider the stories, the evidence, the same that I'm talking about on the criminal justice side of things. This is simply not limited to a prosecutor or even a defense attorney. It is. I have to imagine that it is across the legal profession. And I really am honored to be able to share my story with this group, because I recognize it does impact professionals across the legal profession.
For sure. No, thank you. And the Commission on Professionalism this past year, we've been working with judges on vicarious trauma. And obviously, as you expressed in your talk too, they experience it, court reporters, everyone who encounters it. So thank you for that. Ellie, can you be a little more specific with the signs and symptoms of vicarious trauma that people experience, both obviously in their professional world and their personal world?
Yeah, the vicarious trauma is going to show up in both your professional and personal world. Personally, you might feel things like exhaustion, emotional exhaustion. You might just attribute that to long hours and a lot of work, but it might be a sign of that vicarious trauma. Also, problems with sleeping, where you can't get the case off your mind, kind of tossing and turning, or restless sleep, maybe even some nightmares. You might find yourself to be a little bit more irritable, short-tempered, things annoying you a little bit more than they used to. You might have some guilt or shame, or self-blame, like I didn't do enough, the outcome wasn't what I expected it to be, where did I go wrong? Those kind of questions. You also might have some cynicism, the legal system is not doing what it's supposed to be doing, or, that disillusionment that might develop. Professionally, you might see kind of some reduction in work, struggling to concentrate, struggling to make decisions. avoiding certain cases or avoiding certain evidence. You might kind of be pushing that off because it's too hard or too much to deal with. You may start to see some boundary issues where you start to over-identify with clients or become emotionally entangled in their stories. You also might see some signs of burnout, including like some lapse in judgment, difficulty upholding professional standards. We also might see increased absenteeism from people that are experiencing the burnout, maybe some conflicts with colleagues where you're more argumentative, more defensive. But we also might start to see in really severe cases that lack of compassion that might, because you just have to shut it down. You get so numb, so it's so hard to deal with that you might just kind of throw in the towel, so to say, when it comes to that care and compassion.
Oh, for sure. Thank you for those. Michael, you alluded to it a bit in your talk. For those who might be out there thinking, attorneys just need to toughen up. It's part of the job. Why is the commission focusing on this today?
I smile because, as I alluded to, I've heard that for many years of my career, and that's really what we're trying to change. The best way to lose a professional, whether it's a prosecutor, and I obviously need prosecutors, like I said, because of my background. A good way to lose a staff member or a prosecutor is to continue to have that same old mindset. One of the things that we really try to focus on anymore is recruiting and retention, and I think that the younger generation, and I know this conference is going to focus on that a little bit later, is really focused on what's in it for me. How can I, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but what is this profession going to do for me? And one of the things that we have started advertising is the well-being aspects that I commented on, because I think that is an absolute must in our profession. To continue that same mindset is not only going to drive attorneys or other staff out of your office, it's going to drive them into many of the different signs and symptoms that Ellie just talked about, but it's going to be awfully difficult to be recruiting and retaining good employees when that's the mindset or that's the culture that is created within an office, a law firm. And that's what we're really trying to do across district attorneys' offices across this country, is change that culture, change that mindset, make it acceptable to be able to talk about this and to be able to address our own mental health. Because if you want to continue to be a professional serving a client in the most professional way, you have to address these kinds of things and making it okay to talk about.
For sure. And thanks for alluding to our next session on generations. Most lawyers, Justice Rodford kind of, said this in her opening remarks, most lawyers can't really avoid traumatic cases. It's part of practicing law. So knowing this, and I think this gets to some of the questions too, how can lawyers really prepare themselves to recognize and manage the trauma they experience in their jobs? Ellie, why don't you start?
Well, I think first and foremost is the recognition that it does impact our brains. Our human brains are not designed to absorb all this trauma. And so being able to understand that without acknowledging it, without paying attention to it, you're suffering in silence instead. And so I think becoming aware of the signs and symptoms, challenging the stigma about talking about it, and challenging the stigma about acknowledging mental health concerns or topics. I also think building in protective practices such as debriefings, following cases, breaks in your day. Simply 5 minutes of taking a step away from the evidence can reset your brain. So I think that piece of it is really important. I also think being cognizant of your self-care and mental hygiene. We don't all practice the same self-care. We don't all have the same thing that helps us relieve kind of our stress levels. So being able to acknowledge and pay attention to what helps. Some people, mindfulness helps. Other people, it makes them more anxious. So being very cognizant of what it does, what helps you recharge, and building that into your schedule.
Excellent. And Michael, since you kind of since becoming more aware of vicarious trauma, as you indicated, what are some of the things you have done and kind of put into practice in your, in the current day?
Sure. Obviously, I commented on it during my TED Talk. One of the things that we did most directly was create that peer support team within our office. And really, I don't go into much detail, but we modeled it largely after what our law enforcement partners have done for years and done it very successfully and done it in a very accepted way. We modeled it after that to allow for that immediate resource, that employee here in the office or a group of employees who somebody who's struggling can go talk to. Part of it is just trying to force people out of denial. And as the leader of my office, talking about this, telling people that when you have a rough day, when you have something that's bothering you, a trial that didn't go well, or a difficult victim meeting, walk into the elected DA's office and sit down and talk about it. I do that more frequently than I thought, and I have no mental health background. Let me be very clear. I am not an expert. I am not Ellie. But I can sit there and at least listen and say, I hear you. I believe you. Let's try to get you hooked up with time off, a walk, to the justice's comments earlier this morning, to a healthy outlet to be able to deal with these things and not let an employee slip into denial. One additional step that we have taken here in the office, above and beyond the peer support team that I've talked about, is that licensed counselor, the former law enforcement officer, emails all of our employees on their anniversary date within the office and encourages them to go sit down with him for 15 minutes, for half an hour, and just check in with him, to do a mental health check-in, to say, hey, how you doing? How's the job going? What would you like to talk about? I've taken advantage of that, and we've talked about Denver Broncos football, which is a traumatic topic right now. We've talked about family things. We've talked about everything other than the profession, but it's a healthy outlet to just go and sit and be able to talk to somebody. So trying to create that culture of acceptance and pushing people out of denial is really the best way we've been able to approach it so far. And if I had the answer to what the 100% cure-all would be, I probably wouldn't be sitting here today. I'd be retired on a beach somewhere.
Stephanie, I just want to add one thing to
Yeah,
that.
go ahead, Ellie.
I think it's really important to recognize that just because a case is over doesn't mean the emotional toll is over from that case, and not to just shut it out like once it's done. And to internally debrief too. What am I feeling? How did I feel I did? What went wrong? Those kind of things, being able to kind of take stock and change your narrative to that.
No, I appreciate that. So how would someone kind of do that letting go process a little more specifically?
Yeah, I think
asking for a friend.
Yeah. Well, I think what Michael alluded to, like having a space and a place to say, this is how I'm feeling about it, and being able to acknowledge those rage, those frustrations, disappointments, and also having a closing ritual. Like, how do I close my case? Like, how do I put them back in their box and on my shelf? Having a process that you do it routinely so that the tough cases get easier to manage and handle.
Okay, no, that makes sense. Michael, how has recognizing kind of and seeking support yourself personally really, changed the way you practice and also the way you are in the world?
I think that it has made me a much better lawyer, first of all. I have not figured out a way to package up those closed cases and put them on the shelf like Ellie talked about. The case that I talked about, and I'll come back to your question, Stephanie, but the case that I talked about from Frederick, Colorado, who the defendant, I don't say his name, 8 years later, 7 years later, we're still getting emails from all over the world wanting information about it. We got one yesterday from a woman who wants all the police reports because she wants to see for herself. And so every time I get one of those emails, I'm taken back to that same crime scene, that same story, that same feeling that I shared this morning. Being able to talk about it, being dragged kicking and screaming into the 21st century by my wife, who I will be forever grateful. Has made me a better husband for sure. We used to talk about how I would leave work at work and come home, and that really never happened. And so being able to go home and talk just a little bit about whatever happened that day. She also recognizes, however, that in the conversations that we've had, that 10-minute break that I need when I walk in the door is something that can't be violated. I need that downtime to be able to say hi to her, the dog, the kids, before we start talking about work. But it has made all the difference in the world from my own how I feel, my own mental health. I don't wake up in the morning anymore and just have this sour feeling of dread going to work every day. I at least have an opportunity to go and continue to do the right thing for my community and know that I have an audience to be able to talk to at the end of the day. It's a very healthy thing for me. That's my proverbial walk that your justice talked about, is that conversation with my wife when I get home.
Excellent. And Ellie, I'm kind of going to one of the questions too in the chat and building off what Michael said. I do think, as attorneys, legal professionals, it's like, right, we have limited time. So what, like Michael says, the 10 minutes when you walk into the house, what are some other things that, you can do that, are, more in the moment to deal with things?
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned earlier, that just that 5-minute break, stepping away, can reset that brain. But even if it's grabbing a coffee with somebody real quick to kind of take your mind off, not talk about work, talk about those Broncos that Michael wants to talk about. Finding something to shake up that thought process that's happening, that you're kind of ruminating on and sticking with those thoughts. Being able to step away. I think also just making sure you're validating each other, that this is real. It's okay to feel however you're feeling, whether it's anger, whether it's sadness, whether it's hopelessness, whatever you're feeling is real and valid and doesn't have to be fixed. It's not something that we need a solution to. It's something that we need to be able to just express.
Okay. No, thank you for those. And Michael, there's a question in the chat. I think this is going to you. It's asking, what do you tell those young attorneys who think being open in discussing their vulnerabilities may be used against them in applying for future employment or even an appointment like yourself?
That's a wonderful question, and I saw that pop up, Stephanie. I was hoping that you would ask me that question. I think that the first thing that I would say to that question is I have to create my own credibility in my office. I have to be able to tell a young attorney that I have been there, I've done that, and I have tried to work through the different things that I've talked about. I talk very openly about this TED Talk because I want people to understand that this has become a passion of mine. And so when I sit down with a prospective attorney, or I sit down with a brand new employee, I can sit and tell them, this is my story. I would invite you to go watch my TED Talk because it's out there for a reason. Creating that credibility and making sure that people understand that this is a very top priority for me as it relates to my employees, I think gives me the ability to look at a young attorney and say, when you have those tough days, you come talk to me. Please understand, when I have a promotional opportunity, that's not going to be held against you, because I actually see it as a sign of strength, not weakness. When somebody can say, I need help, that means that they're in a proper mindset to be able to go talk to the Ellies of the world to get help they need. That's a strength. I didn't have anybody the last time I ran for election attack me on the idea of talking about mental health, and it's a good thing because I was prepared for that. What I would say to them is, we don't bat an eye in recognizing that our military members and men and women of the military suffer from mental health difficulties as it relates to their profession. We don't bat an eye at the recognition that doctors and nurses and sometimes teachers struggle with some mental health issues or some difficulty with their own well-being. Why would that be any different for somebody who has to look at the photographs and listen to the stories and have chosen to do this as a profession for now 28 years like I have? If you think it's a sign of weakness, then don't elect me. But I think that it is a sign of strength. That's how I would address that.
Oh, that's excellent and encouraging to hear that you were not attacked for that. This really question goes to both of you from the chat. I think, how can lawyers encourage their workplaces to recognize vicarious trauma as real and valid? I know, Michael, not everyone's going to think the same way you do. So are there some strategies to help with that? And feel free to start, either one of you.
Actually, I'll defer to Ellie while I give that some thought, because that's a tough question.
It is a tough question. I think, as Michael had talked about in the last answer, was that modeling. I mean, being able to model straight from the top down that mental health is not something to be ashamed of. It is a strength to admit that you need help, versus it being soft or something like that. I also think being able to help others see their signs of vicarious trauma, with a non-judgmental, non-blaming or shaming way, showing compassion to each other, to help each other out.
I think that the way I would answer that question, Stephanie, is, the more I think about it, is I haven't run into that, to be very candid. What I have seen as part of my role on the National District Attorneys Association, and I've been the state director to that board from Colorado for about the last 10 years or so. Colorado is the only state in the union that has term limits for DAs. And so when I walk into the National DAs Association board meetings, what I see is a group of prosecutors who have been there for 10, 20, 30, sometimes 40 years. And amongst that group, and it's about a board of about 125. When the Wellbeing Task Force started up, and when we started these conversations and we started sharing some of the strategies and some of the difficulties across the country, there was a genuine acceptance amongst all of my colleagues across the country, whether they had been an elected DA for 2 minutes or 35 years. There was an acknowledgement that this is a real thing that their employees are suffering, and there's a very open-minded attitude towards discussions and seeking improvement. And so I think that while my own experience may be a little bit different, I think that we as a profession have gotten to the point where hopefully this is becoming more acceptable to talk about, and I have not run into those roadblocks yet.
Excellent. And Ellie, you alluded to vicarious trauma in others. If people are kind of listening today and thinking, maybe they're noticing something in their colleagues, what is some of the best ways to kind of address that, to get started?
I think kind of having a low stakes opportunity for them for you to reach out to that person, grab a cup of coffee and say, hey, I noticed something's going on. Anything you want to talk about? Find modeling yourself, I'm feeling this way about this case, or God, this one's a rough one. Those kind of statements can help bring other people's thoughts and feelings out. Watching for those red flags of vicarious trauma symptoms. So showing care and concern and compassion for that, helping them acknowledge when it's time to reach out for professional help, when it's time to kind of take that next step, that they might not be managing things on their own. But I think the biggest thing is just validating people's feelings and experiences.
For sure. Michael, anything to add to that?
No, I think that Ellie kind of hit the nail on the head. I'm sitting here nodding along, and I'm really thinking back to my previous answer, and I saw in the chat that there was additional question about, is there any kind of a generational difference? And I think there is, not in amongst the leadership that I talked about, but certainly within the state of Colorado, I've seen that some of our career prosecutors still hold on to some of those old mindsets because I think that it's comfortable. I think it's easy for them to take that approach. It's that easy for them to not want to take on the challenge of trying to address publicly how they're feeling. And so I'm struggling as I sit here and think about how I want to start addressing those kinds of things here in Colorado in my own office. But I think Ellie really did hit the nail on the head with that last question.
Thank you. And what about if you're experiencing the vicarious trauma from the client? Someone's asking in the chat too. But obviously the issue and what's going on has its own trauma, but the client you're representing, Michael, can you start with that one?
Yeah, obviously, I don't have a client. I have a community. I am speaking on behalf of a victim in a courtroom, and I think we've all run into the situation where, on the civil side, I'm sure folks have very, very difficult clients. Oftentimes, we have very difficult, injured, mentally or physically, victims who are difficult to deal with. It's easier for me because I can separate the two and think to myself, I need to continue to do what's best for the community from a public safety standpoint, even if it's not something that the victim wishes to see happen, or if it's something that I have a contrary viewpoint on. I've never represented a private client, so I can't speak to the ethics of or the professionalism with which I would be able to disagree with a client. I have to comport with the Victims' Rights Act, which is a constitutional amendment here in Colorado, and treat our victims with fairness, dignity, and respect. But I know that there's an additional ethical obligation to a legal client, and so I'll be curious to see how Ellie wants to answer that question too. But I'm probably not the best person to ask that question because my community is my client.
And Ellie, I mean, going on that, I'm sure you don't have any difficult clients in your
No.
practice, but I bet we could probably learn something from the world of psychology. How, yes, when you're dealing with clients as well, that are really challenging, what would be your advice?
Well, I think the biggest thing is to remember that they're humans.
Mhm.
Sometimes their stuff gets in the way of that. And I think, especially in the legal field, I think that those soft skills need to be taught more. How do we actively listen? How do we show compassion without being sucked into, the drama or the stories or things like that? How do we be able to maintain boundaries, healthy boundaries, but show that care and compassion and give them the resources or stuff that they need to be able to get through this process? It's not an easy process for anyone. So, being able to offer what you can,
Mhm.
but understand your limitations too.
For sure. And going off that, how do you kind of put limitations? I think that is a hard thing for lawyers. Obviously, as Michael indicated, there's some ethical issues, but if you're setting boundaries, you want to be empathetic, but what's kind of the balance there of empathy and then, really getting to burnout, as people in the chat have indicated?
I think for, in our field, especially for in the mental health field, when you start over identifying or when you start not being able to separate the client from yourself, that's when you've gone too far. And so being able to recognize that you're not getting, if you start to get entangled into their stories or into their lives or wanting to know more or wanting to be there more than what is expected, that's when you have to start saying, I need to take a step back. I need to set some stronger emotional boundaries with this. Because it's not professional boundaries, it's emotional boundaries that you need to set a lot of times.
That's great. That's great. And I think a question too from the chat that is an interesting one that obviously has changed a bit for some offices. Having less time with colleagues in the office and time to talk to peers. Does this add to the trauma? Michael, why don't you start? Are people back, or is everybody in the office mostly for you?
Let me share a very blunt opinion that I have. I hate working from home. I know that this has become a reality after the pandemic, and it's something that many of our employees expect, either as a benefit or as a condition of employment. And while I say that, I still allow some of our employees, to the extent that their individual jobs will allow them to work from home, one day a week. It absolutely has impacted what I have seen in terms of vicarious trauma and the impact. And I hope that Ellie will comment on this, but the isolation is the isolation of an individual cannot be a good thing when it comes to dealing with vicarious trauma and concerns about how you're feeling on that particular day. Without divulging too much, obviously we have some employees here in the office who we try to keep an eye on, who we want to make sure are not being overly impacted. And I have great concerns about where their office is. in the office? Is it too far removed from other peers? Is it too far? Is it too tucked away in a quiet corner too much? Because I'm afraid that that person will close their door, will sit and not reach out, have that socialization, have that ability to talk to somebody. And I can't imagine sitting at home by oneself, struggling with the photographs or the videos or the topics of the cases they're reviewing, and not have somebody to have face-to-face interaction with. I'm afraid that working from home and text messaging and using Microsoft Teams has ruined our ability to have a conversation as a society, and being tucked at home, not having that direct access to somebody personally, I have to think is absolutely detrimental to one's dealing with vicarious trauma.
Yeah, and I'll support that. I think one is, even if you have the greatest support system, you don't have the support system that understands exactly what you're going through, where other professionals do. There is also something that is limiting when you're on a video chat with somebody. You are not sitting there in the emotions and feeling the uncomfortability of the emotions that is necessary to really kind of process how you are feeling about this. You can kind of detach yourself emotionally when you're seeing each other through a screen.
For sure. Um, for sure. And thanks to Justice Cunningham for the comment for the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. We will definitely, this is a huge issue, and we definitely have, as the commission, worked with the judges, as I mentioned, and it's really had a huge impact. So we hope to do all that we can with this. In terms of kind of some practical things that we've talked about, a lot of things, what would you suggest would be kind of one thing that you both, from some of the stuff we've talked about, so people don't get overwhelmed, what's one thing that people could do tomorrow to kind of either check in with themselves about this, or a colleague, or put into practice?
I'll take it first. I have two things. I'm not going to stick it to one. I'm going to take it to two.
All right, I'll give it to you.
The first thing I would say is today, ask yourself honestly, how am I doing really? And ask that same thing to a colleague. And two, identify your self-care ritual. What helps you decompress?
I think my answer, Stephanie, would be along the same lines as Ellie. It would be to sit down and spend 3 minutes with yourself and ask yourself, or give yourself permission to seek help. Everybody can benefit from sitting down and talking to somebody. Give yourself a permission to try it. I think folks who sit down and give themselves that permission and reach out to a mental health professional, a counselor, a therapist, will be very surprised by how impactful it can be in a very short period of time. I'll take two, since that Ellie took two. Oh, sorry, my lights are going out here. The other thing would be to make sure that you are consciously finding a healthy outlet to deal with whatever stresses you have in your life. As a profession, whether it's Illinois, whether it's Colorado, whether it's anywhere else, we know the prevalence of substance abuse, alcohol abuse. The answer can't be go home and crack open a bottle, because it helps numb the pain. The answer has to be the walk that was alluded to earlier, or playing golf, playing with your dog, playing with your kids. Find a healthy outlet for the stress that inevitably builds up in all of us, and try and really focus on that once a day. That would be my non-mental health professional answer.
No, thank you both. Those are both really good. Ellie, as kind of a follow-up, there were a few specific kind of questions. Are there any in the chat? Are there any specific therapies that are better for dealing with vicarious trauma, that if people are interested?
Yeah, there are some that are better or better suited for vicarious trauma, because it isn't trauma specific work. And that's the thing I think people struggle with the most, is they go to find a trauma therapist and they're trying to process your own trauma and not process the vicarious trauma, which does look differently. And also a professional that will understand the field, because I think sometimes us mental health counselors may not completely understand the legal field, and or say, well, maybe you need to put boundaries in place, or maybe you need to stop taking those cases, or maybe you need to stop doing. So you want to find some therapy that they understand the work field you're in. Two, you want to find someone that understands vicarious trauma versus traditional trauma work. Things like EMDR are not going to work for vicarious trauma, because EMDR is to identify a specific traumatic experience. So those are the kind of things to not look for. I would look for someone that is willing to do more complex trauma work. If you are looking for a professional, complex trauma would be the words you're looking for within the treatment modality.
Okay. And one other follow-up for you, Ellie, was someone in the chat was asking if you could kind of specify what you meant by the closing ritual when the case is over.
Mm-hmm. And I think somebody actually dropped in the chat one of their great closing rituals that they do, where they write their feelings on a piece of yellow stick-em paper and then tear it up at the end. That's their way of kind of wrapping up that case and closing it. So whether it's some type of visual to your feelings, whether it's outlining your pros and cons to that case, or whether it's buying yourself a coffee down at Starbucks, whatever it is to say, I can breathe, that case is done, I'm ready to move on.
Perfect. And Michael, anything to add that you've done recently?
One of the things that we have done is try that debrief strategy to sit and talk with, that we've talked a little bit about, that was alluded to, whether it's just sitting and talking from a professional standpoint about how the trial went, how jury selection went, how did the certain witnesses go, to a little bit of self-reflection about how an individual's attorney performed. But it all inevitably gets into some discussions about how you dealt with the case, how you're going to deal with the case going forward in a healthy way. Those kinds of conversations are really what we've been able to do from a strategy standpoint. I'm going to try that notepad idea, though. That's a pretty good idea.
Mm-hmm. That is a good one. Thank you for sharing that. And I think this question from the chat also gets to kind of how it all impacts everything. So, if the vicarious trauma builds up over time, can it lead to internalized bias in how we view cases and evidence? And if so, how can we avoid that? Michael, I'll have you start on that one. But Ellie, be ready.
Yeah, I'm again looking forward to Ellie's question. One of the things that we have talked about from a prosecutor standpoint is to avoid that buildup over the course of time, particularly in the attorneys, the investigators who work on the crimes against children, which we know is so difficult for many of us to deal with, is to strongly encourage all the things that I've talked about in terms of going and talking to a counselor, sitting down and making that appointment. I've talked to some of my colleagues who have actually made that a condition of employment in that particular unit, that it is mandated that they go talk to a counselor or a therapist every 6 months. I don't know how effective that is. I don't want to get to that point personally, but it's just a recognition that in those truly high stress, high vicarious trauma types of caseloads, monitoring that and really making sure that it doesn't build up to those levels, because I think that's when we get into some of those horrific results that I commented on in my talk about addiction or worse.
Thank you, Ellie.
Yeah, I think the cornerstone of the definition of vicarious trauma is it changes our worldview. And so if we don't address it and we don't focus on it, we are going to become cynical and unmotivated. And it's a great way to lose great people in the profession, because it's going to burn them out. It's going to take its toll. you're not going to be interested in doing the work anymore. So kind of rechecking into those values and beliefs and why you went into the field that you went into when you did, and keeping those back in your center of your focus. Like, what is this all about? Why did I want to do this? And helping trying to minimize that, trying to catch it when you're crisp around the edges instead of when you're burnt out. I think that's because it will have an impact on how you look at every case after that.
Oh, thank you. And I know I forgot you, Ellie's used this, burnt around the edges.
Around the edges.
Yes, which Michael and I both appreciated when we had our first conversation. Can you just talk about a little bit of how somebody can kind of, what are some specifics that they know that they're there, and before they get to that next step?
I think the biggest thing that a lot of people will recognize is getting irritated more easily. Also losing interest in what you're doing. That passion that you had starts to dim. And that's where you can start to say, I don't want to show up for work every day, or my heart isn't in this right now. Those are really good early warning signs that you're heading down to that burnout phase.
Appreciate it. Michael, any other thoughts on that? Like, where do you have a better sense now, being more aware of things like when it's going too far?
Yeah, I just read the comment in the chat from Mr. Palmer, who said that was his advice 25 years ago, to tell law enforcement to go home and have a drink. That's when it's gone too far. But no, I think it is that irritation. It's that inability to interact with the courts or the court staff or colleagues or the defense bar in my world, on a professional level. That's when, to use Ellie's phrase, folks are getting crispy around the edges, and they need a vacation, they need some time off, or they need some of those healthy outlets. But sorry, I'm still thinking about the stiff drink when you get home comment, because that was accepted when I started, and now that's horrifying to hear, because we know that is not the way to be dealing with this, for sure.
Right. And how do you let it? I'll start with Michael, kind of building off of that. How do you not let it really take away your, inspiration or your motivation for, what you are doing? Like, how do you keep in mind that, why you took this job, why you ran for this job in your case?
I think that this I'll call it this realization, this internal revelation, has actually made me better at that. It has made me more passionate for this job, because I can come to work and I can hear and read and see the things that we've been talking about now, all afternoon, and know that I'm going to be able to go home and still be in a good place mentally, for my office, for my family. The passion for the job has been reignited, because I don't have that fear, whether it was in a unconscious or subconscious fear or otherwise, that if I have to look at that set of photographs again, I'm not going to be able to continue to do this job. Other than looking forward to a retirement someday, I know that I can continue to do this job because I can do it in a healthy way, because of the things that I have learned, listened to, and like I said, been dragged into by a very supportive wife. So yeah, it has made me much more of a passionate prosecutor than I was 15 or 20 years ago.
Oh, that's great. Ellie, any additional thoughts on that in terms of keeping, an eye on the mission or your kind of passion for things?
Yeah, I think being able to identify how you're feeling now and what might be getting in the way of it, is this the same feeling you had coming out of law school, or is this the same feeling you had going into law school? Sometimes that's more of where the passion was going into law school. But taking stock and really saying, what is going on? How am I feeling about this job? How am I feeling about my responsibility? Because it really is a serious responsibility that you have in the field. And so how are you feeling about it? Still sitting with you, still enjoying it, still, if not, could it be this vicarious trauma seeping in?
Oh, excellent. We have about 2 minutes. So in prosecutor style, Michael, I'm going to ask, would you like to give a brief closing, and leaving Ellie just a bit of time for those in attendance?
Sure, I can do 60 seconds or less to share with my fellow panelist. Really, I would close the same way I close my TED Talk, which is this is not an easy task. This has not been something that we take very lightly. This is an institutional reckoning, I think is what I referred to it as, because it's something that we have had to change office by office, county by county, state by state. And I think that we are making excellent progress, like I've talked about. We have got to be able to look at an employee who's struggling and say, I believe you, what can I do to help you? Not get back to work, because they won't get back to work. They will go somewhere else. They'll find something else to do. They'll find dull work, to allude to one of the comments that I just read. I would invite anyone who wants to share my TED Talk, please do so. I don't do that for my own personal benefit. I don't care if people remember who I am. What I want is people to remember this message and remember that this is a discussion that has got to happen in each of our own offices, our own firms, our own courtrooms. It needs to happen with jurors at the end of a trial, because we know that they are suffering from these same kinds of things, and we haven't really commented on that this morning. But please make this a part of the culture, make this acceptable for the folks that you work with to discuss.
Thank you. And Ellie, anything additional while we wrap up?
I think it's really important for all of us to go forward to destigmatize the seeking of help. Seeking help behaviors is seen as a strength, not a weakness. And also to know there are all different types of mental health professionals out there. So if you've never been one that really liked therapy because it was too touchy-feely for you, there are mental health professionals that take a much more direct and opinionated approach to therapy. So there are definitely, so don't give up, I guess. That's my statement, is don't give up.
No, thank you. Thank you both for really this discussion and shedding light on this important issue.